Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's NCVO webinar in partnership with our trusted supplier, Zurich Insurance. Now, all charities face risk, and for many of us online today, risks are something that we think about, we talk about, we manage, and we mitigate on a regular basis. As such, today's webinar is titled Risky Business, Identifying, Evaluating, and Controlling Risks in Charities, and I hope the next hour is going to be useful to you all. Today's webinar will be led by Matt Hardwick, who is a senior risk consultant at Zurich Insurance, one of NCVO's trusted suppliers. But before I hand over to Matt, I just wanted to touch on a couple of housekeeping points. So you'll have noticed that closed captions or subtitles have been enabled and will be appearing on screen. To turn these on or off, please click on the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. A PDF of the slide deck today has also been shared into the chat, which you can download to zoom in and out of the slides if this would help. Today's webinar is being recorded, but everyone is joining in view-only mode, so your cameras and your microphones are both automatically turned off for today. So the only people that you can see on screen are those who are presenting today's webinar. Lots of people, I'm sure, will have questions, and we'll have a Q&A session towards the end of today's session. So if you have a question as we go along, please submit this via the Q&A function by clicking on the Q&A icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. The questions you submit to us will only be visible to the presenters, so only to Matt and I, and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible in the time that we have available. There won't be a break today, so if you need to step away from your computer for any reason, please feel free to do so. And we aren't expecting any fire alarms where we are, but obviously please keep an ear out for them wherever you're joining us from. And finally, we'll send a follow-up email shortly after today's webinar with a copy of the slide deck and a link to all of the things that we mentioned. We'll also be posting things in the chat, so links to things that we mentioned as we go along today. So do keep an eye on that too. So without any further delay, we've got a packed agenda for you for the next hour. So Matt is now going to take over the screen sharing ability and talk us through the next 40 to 45 minutes on the Risky Business webinar. So Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Hopefully I've stolen the screen accordingly.
You have indeed.
Brilliant. Hi everyone. Thank you all for joining. Gosh, Monday afternoon, let's talk about risk. There's nothing more exciting I'm sure in everybody's lives. Just building on from Nick's kind instruction, just a little bit about myself. As Nick mentioned, I'm Matt Hardwick, one of the consultants at Zurich. I've been here about 5 years. Some of you may have seen me. I crop up periodically at events like this. Internally within Zurich, I sit on our charities leadership team. So often when sort of risk conversations are happening within the charity space, it's likely that myself or my name certainly gets involved and is utilised. For those of you who have heard me before, I can only apologise. It's probably not improved, but that's where we're at. Prior to Zurich, I spent 12 years in the public sector, working in a variety of roles, ultimately included risk management, which is there when I made the jump from the public to the private world. So all in, I'm probably getting on for 10 years worth of time and experience within the risk management industry. Albeit, I obviously now work for an insurance firm, but please, when it comes to your questions, don't ask anything about premiums or how underwriting works, because it's a mystery to myself as well. It's a mystery in the dark art. But as Nick mentioned, what we're here today to talk about is, this sort of, we recognise that what goes on is, part and parcel and day-to-day activities of what you're always doing, but where we can perhaps provide some structure, some clarity in some cases, that will help you go forward and make it a supportive and best practice tool rather than the traditional potentially eye-rolling subject of, oh, it's risk management, or it's the risk register, oh, let's leave it to the end of the agenda and try and do something with it if we've still got enough time. Hopefully what we go through today will give you some ideas of how that can be even more informative or even more beneficial. And as Nick mentioned, there's the chat function, there's the Q&A function. If you've got any questions or any specifics that you want to raise, feel free to do so, or indeed perhaps have a conversation afterwards. More than happy to sort of hang around and try and pick those up, or I think my email address is at the very end of this as well, so reach out as best you can. So by way of an agenda, and Nick sort of alluded to the fact that there's quite a lot in this next hour. I've tried to break it down into sort of fairly key areas. So, we're going to look at what we mean by risk and give some benchmark and some clear parameters of where we're starting from, look at the process, and then going through all the other bits that are on the screen there, as you can see. As you see, there's that final wrap up and final questions. We're probably going to have about 15 minutes Q&A at the very end. Please utilize that time. This is, a really good opportunity. Chances are, if it's something in your own mind, it's probably on other colleagues that are on the call's minds of how this can work or how it may or may not work for them already. So without further ado, what do we mean by risk, and indeed what is enterprise risk management? ERM may be a concept that you may have come across before. I wanted to break this down into its absolute purest context. And risk, fundamentally, when we're looking at risk, we're talking about uncertainties that are surrounding potential outcomes that may have an impact on our organization. Our organization, as is any organization, fundamentally exists to deliver on its objectives. Those objectives, manifest themselves into, organization plans. They may even, depend on the size of the organization, be broken down further into different service or department plans or whatever they might be. But fundamentally, there's that manifesto of what it is we're looking to deliver. And risk is all of those somewhat unknown bits that may or may not have an impact onto those potential objectives. Risk management is the supporting element of risk. So the risk is the identification of it, and then risk management predictably is those activities that we start to put in place. Some of them will always be there, an inherent element of risk, and therefore there's always those existing controls at a very operational level. Things like risk assessments, will be done, will be reviewed, and we're always in place to manage those risks. But then on a more strategic sense, we might be looking somewhat further into the future. We might have to think about new activities or new ways of working. So risk management obviously sits hand in hand with risk. The third one I've included there, this enterprise risk, the sort of ERM concept, which may be new to people, but fundamentally ERM is about sharing. It's about working across the organization. We want to break down those, perhaps in some cases, those siloed way of working. Chances are your risk will be cross-cutting across multiple parts of the organization. So we need to make sure that we've got stakeholders that have got a voice into sharing that. I often talk about risk starts its life as one person's gut feel. You will sit there and think, do you know what, this feels a little bit risky. I need to have a conversation with somebody about this. And then you might talk to a peer or a colleague who might go, do you know what, actually, I can see where you're coming from, but I perhaps look at it from this viewpoint. And that in its purest sense is risk management. You are sharing and you are having that conversation. What comes out at the end of it, and what we'll get into later on in terms of what gets populated into a risk register, is that then the decisions that are made and that snapshot in time as to what it is that we're trying to articulate. But we're looking to ensure that risks exist in the context of our business strategy. So that's our starting point. That's at the heart of what it is that we look at when we're considering risks. Risk management, and it's going into a little bit more detail, and some of the points on the screen I'm sure are things that you will be able to recognize and resonate with how you're already working, how you're already looking to manage risks. I've already mentioned about how they focus on the objective. So what is it we're trying to deliver? What's our main key topic, our main key threats to achieving those objectives? There's always the positive side of risk management, the opportunity risk, something that we may actually seek out deliberately. We want to exploit, we want to strive to achieve. But in its most infancy, the easiest way and the easiest concept to get hold of is this risk being a threat to the organization, having that some degree of uncertainty around how we're going to deliver. Once we know what it is, that's when we can start to apply that analysis. So we start getting our risk matrix out. We can start considering the likelihood and the potential impact of what it's going to be, and that then allows us to go into how we're going to manage. And risk analysis, it says on the screen there, is that prerequisite of good risk management. We want to be making solid risk-based decisions as an organization. And what I mean by that is, having that balanced view, making sure that the decisions are being made by, senior management teams or board level trustees are backed up by a clear understanding of what the potential impacts and threats are if we do or don't do this particular decision that we're looking to strive for. And that for me is where risk management is absolutely paramount to how the organization will continue to flourish and continue to work as it goes forward and ultimately strives for and achieves those objectives that we've set out. There's a few other points on the screen there. I'm not going to go through all of them. Reducing or eliminating surprises. We've all had those Monday mornings where the phone rings and it completely changes what you're going to be working on for the next few days, because that event has occurred that we may or may not have predicted, but we've suddenly got to shift the way that we're working. Best example recently has been the pandemic. What we all lived through starting back in March 2020. Many of us were probably glued to the TV screens on a Sunday evening to watch the then Prime Minister tell us what we could or couldn't be doing, depending on, in some cases, our geographical postcode, the following day. Those surprises, after a while, as organizations, we were starting to utilize our resilience that we'd got and starting to manage those potential risks, those potential threats, and make sure that we were creating a smooth journey for ourselves. The last point I'll pick up on this screen is this total cost of risk. So total cost of risk is a concept that's more utilized when we start looking at the analysis of our risk, and we start looking at the consequences, the how big, how bad. What total cost of risk encourage us to think about is not just the easily identifiable elements of the consequences. So we often refer to this in Zurich as being the iceberg. Think of that 20% that sits above the iceberg as being, okay, if we've got a risk of losing a building due to an extreme weather event, okay, if we lost the building, then there may be some impact on the cost of having to shut the building and perhaps making sure that people are safe and working in their new environments. But then there's perhaps a little bit of making good work that needs to happen to that particular building, and some of those costs are relatively easy for us to understand and relatively easy for us to quantify. The 80% iceberg that sits below the surface, these are the more difficult elements to quantify. Of actually, do we potentially have an impact in loss of production because we got services that were utilizing that building that were sat next to each other physically in the building, but they're now working in different locations, or we're either at home or potentially being rehoused into another office space that we've got. But in doing that, we may have shifted and changed the way that those departments are working. That's made them less effective. There may be individual sort of social networks that have been created from cohabiting within that building that we've now had to eradicate, and what does the impact on those individually. So it isn't an easy element, that 80% below the surface, but when you are starting to consider your risks, just challenge yourselves and challenge your own minds around, have we fully articulated all of the potential consequences related to this? And as I say, that iceberg's a really good element, thinking of the easy bits and then thinking of perhaps the knock-on impacts of that and what that might look like. So risk management, as we started alluding to, is about understanding what it is we've identified, and understanding what we perceive as those threats on our objectives. And that might come down into, like I say, service deliveries and potential vulnerabilities that we might know of. And then we're not here to fundamentally eliminate all of the risk, all of the negative things that could happen. But if we can smooth that journey out from A to B, I often talk on this diagram, I say, where we are today is the only certainty we've got. We have a plan about where we're trying to get to, but we can't control everything in our minds. We want to try and ensure that we are as best prepared for those bumps in the road as we can be. I'll talk a lot within this session and indeed later on in more detail around what I mean by organizational resilience. That ability for us to change and for us to flex and to be adaptable is absolutely paramount. And it's risk management supports that. It's a really good tool when used very well, but equally I know it's often a tool that sometimes can be, are we doing this right? Have we got the right things captured? What do we do now once we've got it captured? How do we continue to make it evolve? But I like to think of risks as, at its very core, think of this sort of diagram of, we know where we are today, we know what we're trying to get to, the risks are that journey in between us, and if we can identify and manage these, then we're going to be in a really strong position to support the organization in making those decisions. We're seeing lots of changes come across, not just the third sector, but all parts of the public sector working way. And with those changes, risk management is becoming increasingly important in the voice that it has at the top table in supporting those decisions. How do we go about it? So we may already do this within our organizations, but we don't necessarily have it documented and drawn out. This is a risk management cycle that that perhaps looks relatively complex, but actually probably when I talk it through, you'll start to recognize all the key bits that you already do. And within your own risk management frameworks, if you've got them, you may have a risk management process that you utilize that may look similar, but equally slightly different, but fundamentally probably follows a cyclical process, which is all this really does. So starting at the middle, at the top, we've got established context. That is our objectives. What is it we're here to do? What is it we're here to deliver? Once we know where we are trying to get to, that's when we can start to consider what our risks are. So that middle box on the screen there, assessing risks. Assessing risk is broken down into identification, analysis, and evaluation. For me, risk identification is absolutely the most important part. This is where we want to be making sure that we've not just identified the risk, but we've identified the root cause of that risk. The easiest way and the best way to do it, and when I'm talking at training sessions for individual organizations, I become somewhat naive and almost revert back to your 5-year-old self of asking why. Why can't we do this? Why is that? Why is this a problem? That will allow you to get into the real root cause of your risk. And what I mean by that is, by way of an example, if I'm often presented with risk registers and organizations also, can you have a look at this? Have we got it right? And there might be something on there that says, do you know what? Service delivery is a risk for us. Okay, well, my first question is why? Why is service delivery a risk? And so you start getting down into slightly deeper detail every time you're asking why. So the initial element of service delivery is, well, we're capacity of the workforce. Okay, well, why is the capacity a problem? Well, it's because actually there's been a few people who've retired recently as part of the pandemic, so they've taken the opportunity to say, do you know what, I'm done. So we've got vacancies. We're then struggling to fill those vacancies. Well, why are we struggling to fill them? Well, actually, we're working in a particular sector. We've got another organisation that's similar to ours that works down the road, but actually they're paying a little bit more money than what our budget currently is for those posts. So we're seeing people, they're finding it easier to apply. Or it may well be that we're trying to recruit into a very specialised area, and just attracting those skills is very difficult. So straight away, we've gone from service delivery being the risk to actually identifying that we've got perhaps some disparity in the budget structure for this particular role that then is leading into a series of consequences, not least, difficulty filling posts, that leads to increased capacity on existing workforce. And ultimately, the how big, how bad does that get? That gets us into the service delivery having the knock-on impact. When you look at your risks that you've already got, just challenge yourself around, are we really identifying the root cause of this, or are we almost documenting the that negative element, that consequence, as being the identification? Once you've done the identification and you've got that right and you're happy with the root cause, that's when you can move into the analysis. So that's when we get the matrix out. We start to consider the likelihood of it, the probability of it. We evaluate this risk. We start to consider, what's already in place in terms of our actions, but then, what's our current score, and where do we want to get this to? What's our ambition of managing this risk? Where do we say that this is now comfortable? And that brings us into, you may have things like risk appetite and heard that concept, but that is something that can filter into this area here. So that's our assess risks in the middle. So, as I say, we started with understanding our objectives, then we start to go through the assessing risks. Once we've got that bit of work out of the way, we start thinking how we're going to manage this. And, there are the common practice is to use the 4 T's methodology. We'll look at this a little bit later on in terms of options available to us and what the theory suggests is available to us. And then once we've applied those actions and we document them, and as you can see, what we're ultimately doing here within each of these stages is building ourselves a risk register. And we're going through all of the fields and all of the areas that we'd expect to see within a good risk register. That then allows us into the monitoring and the review. As I say, it's very much a cyclical process. So what we've identified, actually, we may come back to review this in 3 months later, 6 months later, and decide that actually something slightly changed here. That service delivery risk that we thought we'd got that was due to recruitment, actually we've now recruited into the vacant post. So we've got no vacancies, but they're now in a process of upskilling. They're not yet fully signed off in terms of the work that they are doing. And so we've still got capacity issues. We've still got the potential area of service delivery being impacted, but we're managing this now in a more comfortable weather. So the likelihood of us hitting the significant consequence of that service delivery being dramatically impacted is no longer there, but we're still recognizing that there is that potential. Whilst we've still got fairly junior staff who are learning the ropes, they may only be a month or two in post, and so not yet fully up to speed with the process of the organization. So that initial risk has possibly changed, or may have even no longer been the case, but you now need to update it, now need to change it. And that monitoring review obviously then leads into the establishing context again. So that's our cycle. We're back at the start. And right across all of those, as you can see down the left-hand side, is your communication consultation. So this is the ERM bit that I talked about. This is the sharing those ideas, those identifications at the start. And I think this is a concern for us, or I've got a gut feel. You sharing that idea with your peers, with your colleagues, will allow to potentially reinforce, or it may disband some of those concerns that we've got, because actually we might not fully have an understanding of wider parts of the organization. Being able to share that with colleagues through that communication will allow us to challenge our own mindset, and will potentially allow us to pick up areas of good practice going on that we can ensure that we utilize and equally document as part of our risk process. The consultation element is, again, it's sharing it with colleagues, but equally we can, you may utilize other resources available to you, and we'll come on to some of the stuff later on that's available via the NCVO and indeed via ourselves to support organizations in driving this. But that in a very, hopefully, now looks and appears a more simplistic diagram than perhaps when it first appeared on the screen as to how that process works. When we're looking at identification, I mentioned that identification for me is absolutely the most integral part of getting the whole thing right. I like to try and break risk down into these sort of three category areas. And a good risk description will have a cause and a trigger. I've seen too many risk registers in my experience that have a risk description that has one word, maybe two words in it. It's not enough. Again, a great example, and it reverts, I'm bringing back my sort of five-year-old self. When Brexit was getting a lot of the headlines, so, post the election or the referendum, and then all the actually, what are we doing here, and what's Brexit going to look like? I came across a number of risk registers where Brexit was on as a risk description. That was it. No other detail, just said Brexit. Again, my first question as the five-year-old self is, well, why? What is it about Brexit that's the problem? Well, we don't know. Well, actually, I agree, we don't know. And it was only until, there's lots of stuff that was going on, and organizations were trying to understand what it is. But what we were trying to figure out is, what is the situation or the event, the cause? What is the root cause of this particular element? And then Brexit is an element of it, because that's the trigger event in this example. We know Brexit was going to happen, but we didn't really know what it was going to be or where, and so there wasn't yet enough information for this to be a risk. Interestingly, in Zurich, we had a whole department that was considering Brexit and was trying to understand what Brexit was going to be. Brexit only appeared on our risk register as an organisation when there was talk of a no-deal Brexit, because that then became something quantifiable of, okay, in the event of a no-deal Brexit, which we know were happening because it's Brexit, the consequences, which is the final element of the a good risk description, the consequence is going to be X, and this is our how big, how bad. Human nature is brilliant at consequences, because we as human beings jumped to the worst case scenario. Those of you who've got children, how many times have they wanted to climb a tree or climb a wall or climb something else, and as a parent you'll say, no, don't do that, don't do that. In your mind, you've already automatically jumped to that worst case scenario. You're going to fall, you're going to break your arm, it's a Saturday afternoon, we're going to be stuck in A&E for the next 6 hours because you've done something that I can already perceive the dangers of. Apply that same mindset to business context. Actually, what is the worst case scenario? Going back to our service delivery example, what is the worst case scenario if our service delivery is impacted? Well, actually, how big, how bad? If we're delivering service, sort of, front face services to individuals, likely to be individuals that may suffer from mental ill health or may suffer from physical depravity, our how big, how bad could be very serious injury, or even worst case, it could be death of an individual that utilizes our services. Risk management always says start at your worst case scenario and you work your way backwards from there. That then allows you to consider what the how you're going to articulate the future elements of this risk in terms of the scoring, the probability, the impact of it. But those, again, think of the risks that you've got in existing risk registers and challenge yourself as to whether they are achieving and providing information for each of those three elements there: the cause, the trigger, and the consequence. By way of an example, I've sort of mocked one up that hopefully gives even more insight into how this might look. So we've got, in this particular one, I'm talking about rates of pay. So our causes, we've got, as our organisation, fictitious organisation A, I'm saying we've got reduced rates of pay, and that's increasing the potential footfall of existing staff seeking moves away from the organisation, but equally makes it difficult potentially for us to recruit new people into the organisation because the rates of pay are below market value, for argument's sake. So that's our what and our where, that's our cause problem. Our trigger is, so alongside our own rates of pay being poor, actually we've done some market research and we realized that competitors are paying at a higher level than ourselves. So we've now got, not only are we paying poorly, but we've got competitors who are paying better than ourselves. So the impact of that, how big, how bad. So I'm saying we're losing experienced staff, skilled staff, reduction in service delivery quality. That might reduce our own organization's reputation because those good people are leaving us. It might have an impact on the remaining staff's morale. They're now taking on increased caseloads, increased work. If we can document the detail that we've got on screen, or something similar to that within the risks that we're articulating, that first bit of risk description, I promise you'll be 95% of the way there in terms of how well to manage risks and how well to sort of articulate those risks within a register. It makes the rest of that cycle really easily, because when you get onto your matrix and indeed the subsequent management actions and stuff, it's very clear to see what it is we're trying to influence. And indeed, at a future stage, we can work out as and when this risk is something that then sits within an appetite we are comfortable with, and therefore no longer need to perhaps document quite rightly on the risk register. Risk registers can become a repository for all the bad things that might happen. And actually you want to be quite proactive in challenging yourselves of, if these risks, some risks we will have are inherent to the organizations that we do. We deliver services that are risky. The title of this session is called Risky Business. There are risks, quite rightly, that are inherent to us. But if they're being managed well, challenge whether they belong on a risk register. I did a session last week, and an organisation had got over 50 risks on their register. And they were quite adamant at the start that they were all elements that needed including. We spent the first hour of the session talking about what are our biggest concerns for the next 12 months. They gave me a list of 10 things. So I said, great, are these all on the register? Yes, we're confident that these are all on the register. Excellent, that's even better. So we're documenting the things that we're talking about. But those 10 things we've talked about, what are the other 40 things on your register that have not come up in this first hour of conversation, but you are saying to me on the register need and warrant a place? Actually, do they warrant a place? Because they're not in our minds of the problems. What we actually transpired is many of those 40 items were risks that, yes, they exist, but are they really something that we're struggling to manage at the moment? And that I think for me is the biggest challenge. And understanding what the root cause is will help us to do that, and starting to document our risks in this area will help us. Once we've done this, as I say, the rest of that process is really easy. So we can then get out the matrix. So this is, just a fairly simplistic 5x5 matrix with the red, amber, greens. We consider the likelihood, we consider the impact. A good risk management framework will have supporting guidance into, what do we mean by low impact or low likelihood. You might also see within your own organizations that risks are broken down into some categories here: finance categories, legal, health and safety, well-being, others that may include it within there. And good practice, and this is perhaps nudging into future developments around risk appetite, would start to then consider, well, what do we mean by likelihood of a finance risk between, how do we differentiate between 2 and 3? And you may consider putting an individual value on that. I've seen other organizations that have talked about percentage budgets, things like that. But it's supporting information that ultimately is helping that initial gut feel come to life. And again, with likelihood, what do we mean? What's a 3 and what's a 4? Well, do we think it's going to be the next 6 months, or are we talking the next 12 months, or are we in the next 2 years, or are we in the more immediate sense saying, do you know what, this is going to happen in the next month, and that might be high likelihood area. So that's your matrix. Yours may look slightly different, but at its purest sense, they're all very, very similar and try and do the same thing. The analysis then feeds into the treatment. So risk treatment, I talked about the 4 T's. So the 4 T's are, as you can see on the screen, they're treat, tolerate, terminate, and transfer. The theory is really good at documenting it in this way. So it applies on exactly the same increasing impact and likelihood X and Y axis that we had for our matrix. And what this theory does is break that matrix up into these 4 equal quadrants. And what it suggests is where we've got a high impact, high likelihood risk, we should terminate doing the activity that is giving rise to that risk. Great in theory. The reality is we may be doing something that we cannot terminate. It's part of our duties to deliver this. It's naturally risky. There's a very high impact on the organisation it occurs, and indeed there's a very high likelihood that we think it's going to occur, but we cannot terminate, which means we've got to do one of the other 3 options. Chances are you're going to do a multitude of those. You may try all 3. You're certainly probably going to try treat and ultimately bring it into an area where we're tolerating this particular risk. As you can imagine, so treat risks, these are where we're looking to proactively manage. We're putting some actions in place to ensure that we reduce either the likelihood and or the impact of this particular risk. Tolerate risks, these sit in the very bottom corner, which if we go back to our matrix, is this more green element predominantly. That's going to be a risk that as an organization we're quite content with. I mentioned earlier about we do risky business as an organization. We deal with risks on a daily basis, but where we're comfortable with what's going on, these may have a place on the risk register for a time, but as trend analysis goes on and we say, do you know what, we're comfortable with how this is ticking on, that would be my then challenge, is to say whether this really now is a risk for the risk register. Doesn't stop it necessarily being a risk for the business. And then the other option that's always available is transfer to another party, albeit actually some of the risks we may have inherently picked up, but because we've taken on service delivery on behalf of another organisation, so we've become the transferee, and so we're then managing those risks accordingly. But a great way to think of transfer risks, potentially outside of your own business context, but think of your personal elements, is insurance. Insurance is a great example of transferring risk. You'll probably pay house insurance, car insurance, you might have pet insurance, holiday insurance, all sorts of other insurance. The reason you pay those premiums is so that in the event of the worst case scenario, somebody else is there to pick up and help and support with that. If your holiday is cancelled at short notice, you get in touch with your holiday insurance provider. There may be a slight excess that you have to pay, but then beyond that excess, they deal with everything else from changes in flights to holiday cancellations, hotels, whatever it might be. That they've taken care of it. You've transferred that risk. You've paid a price for it, but fundamentally that's what they do. All of those steps that we've gone through, and I appreciate I've sort of over-egged the pudding when it comes to the identification, but then we go through each of those steps and that forms our risk register, that creates the risk register. And what does this look like? And this is good practice, and many of you will have something similar. We've created a reference, so a unique serial number for our risks. We've given them a title, we've given them descriptions, and we've worked our way through each of these elements, ultimately giving existing mitigations that are in place. We've given scores, and we're striving towards what we're going to achieve, and equally created a named individual who's responsible for it. Possibly one of the ones that isn't on this list, but I've mentioned already, is trend management. Seeing where risks are moving to over the course of a period of time, that monitor and review element that is absolutely vital. That can be aided by the fact that we're seeing these trends and seeing what's coming through. And this risk that's been on here for the last 6 months, what's it been doing? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And if it's getting worse, why? What's happening within these mitigations? And all of that just helps with the challenge process. It helps with the review. Excuse me. So that's a lot of theory around what risks look like and how they work. What I wanted to perhaps start to share with you, and this is actually stolen from a piece of work which the NCVO did around their Road Ahead document. It's available on their website. I'm sure Nick will point you towards it later on today. And so they did an excellent piece of work at the start of the year, breaking down in a pestle analysis. What does the risk list? Oh gosh, put my teeth in. What does the risk landscape look like for the third sector over the course of 2022? And I've pulled out a couple of these because what that future vision was given us at the start of the year is in many cases already come to fruition. So looking at economic the impact on public expense, the increase of inflation and energy price rises. I don't think even probably the NCVO were predicting quite where the cost of living crisis was going to get to by what are we in October, but it was already on that foresight, it was already on that forward plan, and that allows us to start considering, going back to the very heart of what we talked about earlier, is what's our risk landscape, what's our what's our objectives, and what is the potential threats to achieving those. Things like this documentation are great at providing concerns and challenges for us to pick up. I'll not go through each of these. You've already got the slide deck, I believe, in terms of the pack that was provided earlier, but these are great. And there's a signpost later on into picking up the road ahead document. This is a particular piece of work that was done by the World Economic Forum. So again, it's an annual report that looks at risks. This looks at more macro risks on a global level. So it's not just UK, it's right across the board. And this is where everyone gets a creak in the neck because you'll start trying to read the words that are going the wrong way down the page. But as you can see, they've broken things down into the short term, so the next couple of years. Medium term is sort of 2 to 5, and then really long-term risks 5 to 10 years. And as you can see, by 5 to 10 years, the perception is the biggest risks are environmental ones. They're really coming to the fore over the next 5 to 10 years. Again, as organizations, it helps us to think about what are we doing now, and what does our organization want to look like in 5 to 10 years, and how do we perhaps need to make subtle changes in the way we're working now to ensure that we are supporting some of these potential areas and making sure that we're in a good position by the time that comes. I started to then think about what do I think the next 12 months look like for organizations within the third sector. These are areas that I think are likely to be on people's minds. I've sort of put this as topics on a mature mind. We regard within Zurich, we regard risk on a maturity scale through to, from a sort of very aware organization, in the sense that that risk exists, that we're doing something, but is it fully embedded across the organization, through to what we class as a transformational organization where risk is absolutely embedded at all points. And these are some of the areas that I'd expect to see on a more aware organization's conversational piece. And picking up some of them, we've got the big squeeze, the financial heartache, and the inflationary pressures. But then what does that mean? Is there changes in future donation spend of public because people are cutting back on what's going through? We've got things like workforce wellbeing. We've been working in very different ways over the last 2.5 years as a result of what happened back in sort of early part of 2020. Some organizations seen a change in bringing hybrid working in place. We're seeing more and more of that, but that in itself is bringing new risks into play. And do we fully understand what each of these mean? That sort of transitional and that continuation of hybrid practices. We've changed some of those dynamics, and leaders are having to change in their own styles of leadership and management of organizations and indeed their staff. There's a few others on there. Ukraine-Russia war is probably one of the ones that may force you to sort of sit up and think, well, how does that influence me? But depending on your organization, humanitarian aid charities are dramatically impacted by what's going on in sort of Eastern Europe at the moment. And you only have to turn on the news every day and there's sort of a different headline, and none of it is positive that's coming out of that part of the world. But equally, there's then impact further down the tree on supply chain impacts of what goes on in something like this that's then having an impact that we may see more locally and to your own organizations. All of what we've talked about, and it's very doom and gloomy, it's probably put you all right off the rest of your Monday afternoon because it's crisis. But what we're trying to achieve in embedding lots of this work and lots of this conversation is trying to create an organization that's got a very strong resilience. It allows you to respond and adapt to various changes. And this diagram, again, might be another one that on initial fronting looks quite complex, but I'll try and break it down and try and talk it through. What it fundamentally starts out at is this organizational core. Knowing what we are doing allows us then to have that fully bottomed out. And well, within Zurich, we've broken our core down into 3 key elements. People is at the absolute heart of it. That's the absolute nucleus of what our organisation is. The processes need to then support those people in delivering what it is that we need to do. And then we've got our own immediate environment that we're working in. And that's our business. That's our core. And then we move out into the disruption management and ultimately our ability to stretch as an organisation. In sort of more detail, the core, as I say, is, environment is knowing the internal, external environment that we're working and operating in. That's on the outer edge of our core. Processes, are these supporting? What are the gaps that may be in place? And then people, skills and experience. One of the examples that we mentioned earlier was about recruitment of staff. Are we getting the right people in at the right area? And do they build and support into the organization's culture? That disruption management, that ability to stretch, then we can break that down into things like sudden disruption and gradual disruption. Many of those sort of thoughts on a mature mind that I had earlier on were actually in some instances you could look at and say, oh, they're very immediate disruptions. They're the phone call on the Monday morning that changes everything, that how we're going to work. But actually many of those are more in the gradual disruption. The cost of living crisis, has been shown with what was in the Road Ahead document at the start of the year. We were already talking about inflation changes, energy crisis or energy price influence. What we're now seeing is much of that coming to fruition, and indeed it's going to go beyond that. What's going to happen over the next 2-3 years in terms of paying back what governmental borrowing is forcing us to. What does that mean? What's that going to look like? There's, every quarter there's inflationary changes. Bank of England is starting to quote new percentages. That's having impacts on how we're all looking and working. These are gradual disruptions. These are ones that we want to get a handle on now. We want to start having that conversation of what does this mean for us? Where is this going to take us as an organisation? What's the potential impacts for us? All of that allows us to then feed into this overall diagram that then creates this outer boundary that says this is our ability to stretch as an organization. And it allows us in some instances to take opportunities and start to develop and being a bit more innovative potentially. But we can only do that if we know our core and then we understand what our disruptions are. And that creates this overall resilience. The chances are that many of us as organizations are incredibly resilient. We've had to be over the last few years as we've had all of these changes, these impacts come upon us. And we may have had to, really bring ourselves down to our core and then allow us to respond and to adapt as we change going forwards. Hopefully that, again, complex diagram starts making a little bit more sense. The downside, or, it'd be remiss of me to sort of think, everything is rosy. I've told you how to do a risk register and therefore it's absolutely fine. That guy from Zurich has told us how it works. And it's, once we've put it in place, the world is going to be a better place. It doesn't always work like that. Things can go wrong. And why does risk management fail? I've tried to break it down to sort of a few key areas: confirmation bias, availability, and hyperbolic discounting. What I mean by sort of confirmation bias is we can sometimes get a little bit stuck on the first idea that we see and the first solution potentially to a risk that we see. We want to make sure that we share our ideas, create different views from different parts of the organization, and make sure that what we ultimately decide is the right thing at that given time. But equally, when we go through our monitoring and review, making sure that we're challenging those mitigations that we had put in place to make sure that they are still the most appropriate and whether they need to change and need to be updated. Availability bias, sometimes we can get so caught up on the immediate nature of what's presently happening, that firefighting that we've probably had to do for much of the last couple of years. If we can lift our heads and start thinking about the wider context, the more long-term view, that's going to allow us to focus a higher priority where it is needed, where it's warranted. And then hyperbolic discounting is choosing the immediate rewards over a potential long-term view. A great example, I was working with an organization. They'd got a budget overspend that was significant, well into 6 figures, maybe even nudging 7. They needed to find a saving of that nature. They found one by discounting a service that wasn't a statutory duty service. So they stopped doing that service, they achieved their budget pressure. But then what they realized is in stopping doing that service, they created themselves a £5 million problem further down the line, because that service was having a positive impact. So although it was costing them £1 million to do the service, its future cost by not doing it was over £5 million. So they chose that immediate reward over a long-term view. And that's where some of what I talked about earlier is that, making sure we've got risk-based decisions. I'm very conscious of the time, I'm giving everyone a Q&A bit. So this is my last slide. But making sure that we've got enough time to focus on it. Don't get bogged down into just creating too many risks. We don't want to be too internally focused. Work with it and challenge ourselves. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Nick.
Awesome, that was great, Matt. Thank you so much. That was an absolute kind of crash course into kind of risk and risk management. And just to remind to everyone, this session has kind of been recorded, and so this will be uploaded to the NCVO YouTube channel within the next week. So you can come back and recap, or you can share this kind of with your colleagues or with your boards as well. And again, a copy of the slides will be shared in the follow-up email that we send out later on today or early tomorrow morning. And so you can go back through the slides and you can adapt some of those kind of slides to create your own templates. But Matt, I mean, are you aware of any kind of risk register templates or programs that others use to manage their risk registers?
Yes, there are loads, and I suspect if you fired up Google, you'd find some. But actually, Nick, I mean, you guys at the NCVO have probably got some of the best templates that fit in the segment, and I know those are available to those that can access them. If they're not available to people that for whatever reason via their own membership arrangements, actually at its purest sense, at its most simplistic way, things like Excel, creating a table. One of the slides earlier on that we went through that sort of had those headings of what should be in a risk register. If you create columns that have got those, then you're creating your own template, but it will be fit for purpose. I know many organizations that utilize Excel and work on Excel when it comes to their risk registers. You can go out and, there are multiple softwares available for people working on risk registers. Software is good as long as people use it in the right way.
Great. And then again, I think Sophie's been shown in the chat some links to the NCVO kind of resources. The template is for NCVO members only. But again, I'm sure if you do have a Google, there'll be things out there that you can adapt for your own needs. Another question for you. Is a risk register for internal purposes only? If we were to change how we record our risk registers or take off tolerable risks as mentioned, do we need to keep historic copies for external purposes such as insurance?
So I would say no. For me, a risk register should be a live, current view of things. So there is limited benefit in retaining historic versions of. I equally believe it's purely an internal documentation. Risks are things that haven't yet happened, and so you're potentially articulating things that are going to have arguably an adverse impact on your organization and as such your delivery of objectives, but equally they may not occur. So that event that you perceive could happen may not happen, and as such the risk may not materialize. And that discussion is something that is very much an internal discussion to your organization. When it comes to in answering the insurance question, chances are an insurer as part of a tender would want to see a current risk register. They wouldn't be bothered about historic ones, and if they were, I would challenge as to why, because those historic ones are historic for the reason that they were risks at the time, but we took actions, we dealt with them, and they're no longer risks. This is our current view.
Great, thanks. And then I imagine online today we've kind of got lots of people who are responsible for kind of like the day-to-day management of risks at an operational level. But then, of course, above them are the board of trustees who have kind of the governance responsibility and are ultimately accountable to the Charity Commission. So could you, a question from Arnold, could you touch upon the responsibilities of trustees? They're kind of coming in thick and fast now, and my questions are zooming up. So could you touch upon the responsibilities of trustees in terms of the risk management of investment funds? That's very specific.
It is, and I suspect I would struggle to do it a disservice within the time that we've got. What I will say perhaps more generally around the role of trustees when it comes to managing risks is trustees tend to be more heavily focused in supporting the governance and the assurance of the organisation, and as such get involved, going back to that cycle that was on the screen earlier on, they are more likely to be involved at the monitor and review, and actually you could say monitor, review and challenge element of it. They have a strong handle on what the objectives are of the organisation, what are the deliveries, and then it's reviewing the output of the risk management process in the sense of the identification, the analysis, etc., etc. And then it's, okay, do we as trustees feel comfortable that we are documenting everything, aware of everything, supporting these risks, are supporting what it is we're trying to achieve? There may well be risks that are not on the register that the trustees want to know about. And quite rightly, that challenge should be supported by officers being able to document, well, it's not on the risk register because we're already taking actions to make sure that risk is suitably managed. So it's a fine balance. That they have a role, they have a very key role, but for me, it sits in the assurance stuff. In terms of the specifics of the managing those funds, that might be one if I can come back to when I perhaps have a little bit more thought time.
Yes, absolutely. No worries about that. And then we've got another question here. There's an organisation who have been asked by their new auditors to include new detailed information in their risk register. And this will include risks that we've been mitigated successfully to the point where they are negligible. Could the absence of these risks be perceived that we have simply not considered or identified them?
Yes, I think it could be perceived as that way. What we need to be able to demonstrate is that we have considered them, and the reason they're not in a risk register is because of X, Y, Z. I have seen some organisations whereby they almost run a live risk register, as I would regard it, that goes to boards, that is utilised by an organisation to support the risk management and the wider context of the organisation. But then they also have what I've seen called a variety of things, but for the sake of it, I'll call an assurance register, which is almost a list of all the other risks that we're aware of as a business, but we're managing, and we're deciding, going back to those 4 T's, we're deciding to tolerate these sit within a comfortable area that, because of all the actions that we've got in place, they are not being proactively managed, but they sit on this assurance register that probably gets looked at, I don't know, probably once a year. I think I worked with an organisation recently where they were doing it really nicely because they got an assurance register that was really quite large, and so rather than looking at it once a year, they looked at a segment of it once a quarter, and then each quarter changed the segment so that over the course of the year they'd looked at all of them. So those risks were not being as regularly reviewed, regularly monitored, but they were there and ultimately aiding and supporting that assurance process.
And I suppose in those kind of scenarios as well, wherever your risk registers are reviewed, just making sure that you kind of got accurate minutes of those kind of conversations.
Yeah, and again, your risk register that you may create if you're creating one from scratch, but a good field to have is things like comments field, and comments field then allows you to, alongside minutes of those meetings, but putting in what is the current position and okay, discussion on X date, this is what we're doing, these mitigations need updating, or whatever it might be. But I always regard your risk register is a live document at the point at which you've finished creating it. Then actually from the following day, you could argue it's potentially out of date because something somewhere may have changed within that risk register. But at that very point in time, that is what we're saying is live and is current for us.
Great. And then someone else just can link to that. If a risk has occurred and an action taken, would you keep a record of the action so that you could understand the successes and the failure or improvements? I would imagine that would be kind of part of that kind of conversation at a board level that would be recorded.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's good practice to sort of, keep those actions and keep those, record of what we did. And, it allows future review. And equally, a similar risk may materialize at a later date down the line. And if we've still got that information that said, well, we did X on this time, could we do something similar? Now, every risk will be different. So it may well be that those exact actions are not best placed, but it may give us a starting point when considering. And, when we talk about risk identification, I don't think I necessarily touched on it or at all potentially earlier, but what we can utilize and what we often think about is lessons learned from the past. And so that could be a good thing, but equally it's about making it proportional. We don't want to create a small industry out of risk management. We've got a finite resources, and we need to make sure that we take what we need to do statutory, and make sure from a trustee's point of view we're giving that governance and that assurance, but equally supporting risk and making it something that is usable for the wider organisation, rather than creating a huge, massive, long list and an industry out of something that's just going to take multiple people to try and manage it from an internal point of view.
Great. And Matt, if we can just fit in one kind of final kind of question, where does setting an organisational risk profile sit in the process?
So I would, anything, for me, risk management sits at the top table. So it sits, with the CEO or whatever the term is, and their supporting senior management team, senior leadership team. They would set that profile, and aligned to that is things like risk appetite, which is very much for me is a development on from once we've got the basics of understanding what our risks are. But that profiling then allows us to consider where do we feel comfortable with as our risks, and where are we potentially actively seeking more risk, or indeed wanting to reduce and eliminate areas of risk that we might be inherently carrying. Going back to our matrix, one thing that's great about appetite, if you go back to our matrix where we've got that red, amber, green, you may have amber risks that, because of the volume on your risk register, you're just not getting down to naturally focusing on the red stuff. But you may have an amber risk that falls outside of an appetite or a profile of where we want to be as an organization, and actually we need to be considering those in exactly the same way that we might be looking at a red risk, because those amber ones that are outside of our profile are very, very important to us, and we want to manage those much more proactively. So it's a really good development, but it sits at the top table, and it sits, I would expect board and trustees to be involved in it as well, in sort of, actually what are we comfortable with as an organization.
Perfect. Matt, let's into the Q&A. Thank you so much for taking those sort of quick fire questions at you. Before we leave today, I just want to take the opportunity just to signpost you to a couple of resources that are available to you. So first up is a link to Zurich's own risk management help and guidance pages, which includes a handy 3-minute video guide to explain risk assessments for not-for-profit organisations. Next up, we have NCVO's guidance on managing risks, looking at the role and responsibilities of your trustees. So this kind of links back to a previous question, to ensure that your trustees have good governance arrangements in place when it comes to risk management. As I mentioned earlier, we've also got a helpful risk register template, which is an exclusive NCVO member-only resource. And if the Zurich and NCVO guidance isn't enough, we've also linked here to the Say Vincent Risk Management Made Simple guide. Of course, it goes without saying that it's important to make sure that you're aware of the requirements of the Charity Commission when it comes to managing risks, and you don't fall short of expectations. So a link to their guidance for charities is being posted into the chat now. Of course, for any questions and queries that you have that you can't find answers to online, you're absolutely more than welcome to contact our small charity help desk via phone or email, and the telephone number and the email address is on screen now. Before we go, Sophie is just about to launch 2 questions as a snap poll to get your immediate response to today's webinar. This is completely anonymous and will appear on your screen any second now. And we're also posting a link to a SurveyMonkey evaluation if you'd like to provide more detailed feedback on the things that you liked, what you think could be improved, or what you'd like to gain more information on. And then finally, just to highlight, if you're not yet a member of NCVO, we would love to have you join our community of over 17,000 organisations, from the biggest household name charities to the smallest community groups. Our members are at the heart of everything that we do, and we exist to make your life easier so that you can focus on changing people's lives and making our community stronger and more resilient. A link to find out more about our membership is being shared in the chat now and will also be included in our follow-up email. So that's all from us today. I hope you found the last hour with us useful, and we look forward to joining you at another webinar in the near future.